I am in Toronto at Archangels with Giovanni Marsico, and I just had a conversation at the end of a day speaking with a woman that has her in tears and me completely frustrated and wanting to warn you, sometimes you never get over bad advice. I'm Alex Sharfin, and this is the Momentum Podcast, made for empire builders, game changers, trailblazers, shot takers, record breakers, world makers, and creators of all kinds. Those among us who can't turn it off and don't know why anyone would want to. We challenge complacency, destroy apathy, and we are obsessed with creating momentum so we can roll over bureaucracy and make our greatest contribution. Sure, we pay attention to their rules, but only so that we can bend them, break them, then rewrite them around our own will. We don't accept our destiny, we define it. We don't understand defeat because you only lose if you stop, and we don't know how. While the rest of the world strives for average and clings desperately to the status quo, we are the minority, the few, who are willing to hallucinate there could be a better future, and instead of just daydreaming of what could be, we endure the vulnerability and exposure it takes to make it real. We are the evolutionary hunters, clearly the most important people in the world, because entrepreneurs are the only source of consistent, positive human evolution, and we always will be. So I'm actually in the convention center. The event just shut down. You might hear some drums or some other ambient noise in the background that you don't normally hear from me. In fact, Eddie's recording a time lapse right now, so this will be in one of my video blogs coming up. If you ever want to see one of those, you can go to sharfin.tv and go to YouTube and subscribe and check out a lot of stuff coming out with the kids and our vacations and how I'm running a remote multi-million-dollar company and how we're homeschooling two kids. So we'd love to share that stuff with you. And but I'm up in Canada, and I just spoke at Archangels, which was awesome. It's such an incredible audience here. And at the end of not my speech, I spoke as part of a panel of five speakers or I think 4 or 5 speakers that all spoke during a full day today. And I had a woman come up to me at the end of the day, and she shared with me that she has gone through some really big frustrations in her business. And I said, well, just tell me what's been going on. And she said, well, I've had a lot go on, but what I found was I need to stop telling my husband what's going on in my business. And, oh, man, every time I hear something like that, my heart kind of skips a beat because I know what that equation does to a marriage. When you stop being transparent with your spouse, when you start holding stuff back from your spouse, you decouple energetically in that marriage. When you don't tell your spouse what's going on in your marriage, you start making that marriage move towards where there's less intimacy. You are proactively making the decision to be less intimate with your spouse. And what you have to understand is that is one of the worst decisions you can make in a marriage. Because eventually it will happen to you. What has happened to so many of my clients and so many people I know is that your spouse is going to have the feeling that you're cheating on them with your business. And in fact, spouses say, I can't tell you how many times I've had a client, both men and women, come to me and say my husband or wife has said they feel like I'm cheating on them with the business. And here's why. You are. You are. If you are proactively no longer telling your husband what's going on or telling your wife what's going on, if you're running a multi-million-dollar company and your spouse doesn't know what's happening, you are proactively creating less intimacy. You are not telling them what's going on with you. You are putting yourself in a situation where energetically you are lowering the connection in the relationship, and you have this whole part of your life that you're not communicating to the person who should be the most important person in the world to you. And it's such a bad decision. I have 2 rules for entrepreneurial success. You've heard them if you listen to this podcast long enough. The first one is your marriage is most important. And the second one is transparency in your marriage is absolute. If you're a married entrepreneur, that's how you win. And you tell your spouse everything. And you get to a place where you put enough process in your marriage where your spouse actually understands what's going on because you went and chose that person. And here's what I believe about high-functioning entrepreneurs, high-level entrepreneurs, those who actually go out and change the world. We go out and we find the person who offsets us, but also is the reflection of what we need to hear. and is the person who's going to be real with us, and is the person who's going to be critical of us when we need somebody to. And yes, I know there are times where the spouse will not support you, but you also have to ask, do they have enough information to be able to support you? And so often when someone says my spouse doesn't support me in my in my business, it's often because you haven't been transparent in your marriage. Now, this isn't 100% of cases. Sometimes there's just spouses that are mean and abusive and aren't supportive and are terrible people. You have to ask yourself if you're in that type of relationship, and you should be holding things back. But if you're in that type of relationship, you should get out. But if there's validity to your marriage, then you should be doing everything you can to create intimacy and transparency and connection, because that's what will make your marriage survive. Every single marriage is terrible at some point. Whenever I meet a couple and they say, oh, we've been married 20 years and we've never had a fight, I'm like, I don't understand what type of alien person you are. Because I've coached entrepreneurs my entire career, and I've never had anyone say I've been married for any length of time and we've never had a fight. There's always fights and disagreements and conflicts and issues and challenges in real marriages. That's just how it works. And the way that you get past it is through transparency, through sharing, through telling your spouse what's really going on. And so I asked a bunch of questions after this woman shared with me that this was her new strategy, that she wasn't going to tell her spouse what was happening. And I said, so, how's it been feeling to you? And she said, it's actually, there's been something there. I've been feeling frustrated with it. I said, how long have you been doing it? She said, about 3 months. And I said, you are carrying the weight of your lack of transparency. And she looked at me and she got tears in her eyes, because that's what's going on. You're proactively holding stuff back. You're doing things that you're really not explaining to your spouse. You're causing a separation. You're causing a lack of intimacy. And when you do the opposite of that, you strengthen your marriage. When you do those things, you weaken it. You just have to admit that to yourself. And so I said, where have you heard this? And she said, well, I've actually been to a couple of masterminds where women who I know well and who are very successful, they told me this is the strategy they're using. And I said, I need you to know something. It's going to be a disaster for them. They're just not going to say it from stage or at a mastermind when they're showing you how successful their business is. Because, and she actually asked me, if I give this advice to male CEOs, and I said, of course, I give this advice to all CEOs, but I just happen to work with a lot of women. And it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. If you make the proactive decision to create separation in your marriage, to create energetic separation, information separation, and true lack of transparency, then you have to know you are creating a lack of intimacy in your marriage, and it's going to manifest in all types of terrible ways. And the thing that drives me crazy about this is this woman had gotten a bunch of reinforcement at masterminds and in other places where people just share whatever they're doing, but they don't have a track record of understanding if it's actually going to work. I said, did you ask those women how long they had been following this strategy? Because you're 3 months in and it already feels hard. Well, I can tell you for them, depending on how far they're in, it's getting harder and it's going to become a disaster. And I just recently, in the past year, worked with a woman who had been following a strategy of not communicating with her husband for a while. And when she finally started having to communication or started having to communicate or started back and communicated with him, it was when he came to her and said, I feel like you're cheating on me with the marriage. Here's what I can tell you that movie looks like, or not the marriage, with the business. When you start proactively not telling your spouse what's going on, they feel it. They know what's happening. They feel your lack of transparency. And it comes up in your conversations. It comes up in how you communicate to each other. It comes up with what you tell each other. Any level of a lack of transparency is going to create more. So it's going to come up over and over and over again. And the two of you are going to feel it. And the challenge is when you go to masterminds, you get advice from one person who's got a strategy that might have given them momentum in the moment. So maybe it's someone who hasn't communicated with her husband for 2 years and her business is exploding. She doesn't know he's about to tell her she's cheating on him with the business. Or maybe it's someone who doesn't feel the same energetic issues you're feeling around this lack of transparency. And eventually, I can tell you, they're going to feel it. Every entrepreneur does. Sorry if you can hear some noise in the background. They're literally cleaning the floors of the convention center. And but here's the point of this podcast is be careful where you get your advice from. Here's what I want you to know about anything I've ever said on this podcast. I am incredibly careful about the advice I give because it makes me crazy when I talk to somebody at the end of an event like this and she is clearly emotional around her decision to create a lack of transparency in her marriage. She was having a really hard time with it. Her eyes teared up. When I hugged her and we were done talking, she was shaking. Why? Because she's heard the opposite of this strategy that she's been being told, and she knew from the very beginning it was wrong. And the problem with going to masterminds and listening to people who maybe are just trying something out is until you find the coach, the consultant, the person who has a track record of working people through something and can talk to you from a place of actual understanding, then you should be really careful about the strategies you follow. Because this one is completely ludicrous. Because it is, instead of, if somebody sat on stage and said, well, the way that I've grown my business is I lie to my spouse and I proactively leave things out and I don't tell them what's happening and I leave them in the dark. Can you imagine how you would feel if you saw your spouse on stage saying that about you? How would it feel to you if your spouse showed up one day and said, hey, I've been working the last couple years on this project and we're moving, surprise. But you're doing it. If you're not communicating to them about the business, you're doing the same thing. So sometimes you will never recover from bad advice. And one of the fun things about masterminds in the event that I was at today is you get to meet a lot of people and you get to talk about things and see what they're doing. One of the challenges is that you need to know the qualifications and the background of the person who's giving you advice. Because one of the biggest issues I see today with my clients is not that they have bad strategies. It's not that they're not good entrepreneurs. It's not that they're making the wrong decisions. It's that they've gotten the bad advice. This woman tonight had jumped off a marriage cliff without even knowing it. And she had all kinds of evidence to confirm her decision and make her confident in it, even though it was feeling wrong. So when you go to events, when you go to masterminds, I want you to know two things. One is you have to be careful with all of the advice you take. Energetically think about it, test it. How does it make you feel? Does it feel like it's the right thing? Does it feel real? And then number two, just because you go to a mastermind and someone gets asked a question and they don't know an answer doesn't mean they won't give you one. Sometimes I've known people who are on stage and do not have the qualifications to give answers that they give, and it has blown me away. So when you're taking advice, make sure you're going to a qualified person. And one of the things that a lot of the people I work with do that makes them incredibly successful is they take advice from very few people and they apply it at a very high level. Because if you're taking in advice from a lot of different sources, first, it's going to confuse you and conflict. And second, when you start taking advice from a lot of different sources, you have to know the background of those sources, the qualifications, or you get crap advice like the woman did here at this convention. So really two messages for this podcast. One is follow the two rules of entrepreneurial success. Your marriage is most important and transparency in your marriage is absolute. And if you haven't been telling your spouse what's going on, if you haven't been communicating, the conversation you have is, hey, I haven't been telling you what's everything that's going on and it's been uncomfortable for me and I want to be able to communicate with you and I want to build some process with you around telling you what's happening in our business. And have that conversation and move in that direction and create the transparency. And like I told the woman tonight when we were leaving, I said, I just want you to think about something. When your spouse supports your business, it means you've explained it to them at a point where you've crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's. And she said, you know what? You're probably really right about that. And a lot of the times in our marriages, when we don't want to be transparent, it's when we haven't crossed every T and dotted every I, and we want to take a big risk because it feels exciting, but we don't have all the answers. And maybe it should be, and a lot of the times for us, that is a incredible resource to have that slows us down to the point where we answer enough questions that we know that we're going to move into success. And the second message for this podcast is be careful with where you get advice. It amazes me how often there are these new types of groups where essentially they're leaderless and it's just a group where everybody gives each other advice. That can be one of the most dangerous things you do, because what you're really hearing is whatever somebody's doing at the moment. So the way to get advice is to find out who's the best in the world at doing what you do, who understands your problems better than you do, who can explain how you're feeling better than you can. That's the person you should be working with. And that's the person who should be giving you advice. That's why so many high-level entrepreneurs work with me, because they've heard things on this podcast vocalized in a way no one ever has, so they know I understand them, and I do. And I will always give the advice that I know is proven, and I have data, and I have a history behind it, and I can tell you story after story, and I can tell you that it only goes in one direction in this case. So when I'm giving advice, whenever I share something with an entrepreneur, I share the strategies that I know work 100% of the time. And if I'm asked a question and I don't know the answer, I don't answer. Thanks for being here with me. This was a pretty awesome conference. I can't wait for tomorrow at Archangel. I'll share with you again what we are doing here what happens tomorrow. I heard it's going to be pretty crazy. And what I'm sharing with the group today was the Billionaire Code. If you haven't yet checked out the Billionaire Code, you can go to billionairecode.com and answer a few questions, and we will send you a full PDF of the Billionaire Code, the 9 levels that every entrepreneur goes through from $0 to $100 million and to ultimate success. You want to know where you are on the code. Go to billionairecode.com. Know the code.